Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the latest of the LexisNexis in association with local government lawyer seminar on the LPS, what happens next. You're very welcome to join us today. My name is Anne Kingsley. I'm the local government PSL for LexisNexis. So I'm delighted to welcome with you a man who probably needs no introduction. It's Alex Ruck Keene KC, who obviously is an experienced barrister, writer, educator, and acknowledged expert in the field of mental capacity, mental health, and healthcare law. He practices from 39 Essex chambers and edits and contributes to what is considered the Bible for professionals in this area, their newsletter. And he's joined today as his practitioner in his capacity as a practitioner counterful by Graeme Kenna, who's a senior solicitor at Bradford City Council, who's experienced in all aspects of children, education, adult social care, community care law, advocacy, and all aspects of local government law in that regard. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them to continue the presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. And it's very nice to be doing this as a double act with Graeme. So I will just do light pontification. Graeme will give you all the practical answers. So you will see I'm not coming to you from my shed. I've been driven out because it's far too hot. So I've come into chambers. And what we've agreed to do is I'm just going to give a quick update on where we are, and then Graeme's going to give kind of how we got here. And then thank you very much indeed to those of you who filled in the questionnaire, because local government lawyer kind of sent around a questionnaire in advance of this, a survey in advance of this. And some really, really interesting responses have come back, which we're together with local government lawyer will be kind of digging into. But Graeme and I are both going to kind of pick out a few things which really struck us from there. And then we're going to kind of segue into highlighting things that we're thinking about in terms of, for instance, risk, and then in terms of kind of short, medium, and long-term things that people in our world are having to be thinking about in the context of LPS not proceeding. So that's what we're going to do. And as Anne said at the beginning, please put questions in the chat function. We will deal with as many as we can, and we'll try and deal with them, as Anne says, organically. So, I mean, I think my opening gambit can be pretty short because we know what's happened, which is back in April. In fact, it's already been 2 months. It feels like, well, in some ways it hasn't been that long, but in some ways it has been that long. The government says we're not going to proceed with the implementation of LPS. The implementation has been delayed until after the end of this Parliament, which is a rather curious phrase in some ways. It could mean, well, we're just putting it on hold for now. We'll come back to it after the next election, and the next election has to be by the end of next year, so we'll come back to it. On the other hand, actually, I don't think that's what it means at all. And I certainly wouldn't be proceeding on the basis that there's simply a delay to LPS and all the stuff that you've been working on, for those people who have been working on it, is just going to be picked up in 2025 and we carry on as we were. Because it's very clear that the decision as to whether or not to implement LPS, so the liberty protection safeguards, and actually the other things which surround it, because there are other things in the Mental Capacity Amendment Act 2019 which we've lost out on. For instance, the Section 4B emergency deprivation of liberty power has gone. The decision whether or not to implement those are going to be for the next government. So it's going to be a political decision for the next government, whoever that is, as to whether or not they're going to implement. And kind of allied to that, as I know you know, the way you can tell whether or not things are actually happening in government is down to the number of civil servants who are actually assigned. And there having been quite a big LPS team at Department of Health and Social Care who were leading on this, it's now down to 2 people. Who are working, I think it's fair to say they are working their socks off, but they're now got the portfolio of not LPS, DOLs, community DOL, and picking up all the pieces relating to the Mental Capacity Act and in the context of adult social care and also healthcare, which is a pretty big portfolio for 2 people to be dealing with. So my message is that we need to proceed on the basis that LPS isn't happening. People may have differing views about whether or not they're happy about that, but it's not happening until and unless a government comes along and says it is now happening. And if they say it is now happening, a lot of work's going to have to be done in terms of picking up the pieces. So in terms of, and one thing I'll say now, but I'm no doubt come back to, is people shouldn't be proceeding on the basis that, well, we can keep delaying various things because we don't need to think about that for much longer because LPS is coming in to either save the day or change the picture. Choose your own metaphor. There are various other things which are going to be casualties, which we're trying to deal with and think about the aftermath. One really obvious thing is what on earth is happening to the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice. So the Code of Practice relating to the main body, the LPS, that's been a victim of the fact it got tied together with the LPS code or part of the code. We don't know yet whether it's going to be de-tied and brought back up and running. So we'll no doubt get into all that kind of stuff in a bit. But I think before we get any further, I'm going to hand over to Graeme, my partner in crime for this, who's going to sort of get us up to speed of, well, how on earth did we get to this point?
Hi, good afternoon. A few additional housekeeping issues. Firstly, if there's a strange barking noise, that's my elderly dog. If there's an ear-piercing screeching noise, that'll be my rescue cockatiel. I may have to put the mic off. For those of you who've turned your camera off, don't forget we have the new AI version of Teams, which can detect tracksuit bottoms, beach shorts, and even which cocktail you're sipping. When they heard about this event, a number of lawyers said to me they'd kill to co-present with Alex. Sadly, they can't be here because of their bail conditions. So some of you, in fact, all of you who aren't my immediate family, will be asking, who am I? Well, if you imagine that Alex is the Rolling Stones, well, I'm that support band you've never heard of, but who are described as a challenging mix of electro-punk, reggae, freeform jazz, Portuguese fado, and Andean nose flute. And you go, should we miss them and grab a coffee and get a later train? So I'm a senior solicitor with Bradford Council, and for senior, think as in railcard. I'm also doing consultancy for Lancashire County Council. Qualified via the legal exec route, and my history includes criminal law, childcare law, and I've been a specialist in adult social care now for over 20 years. I previously worked for Cheshire and the legacy authorities, Calderdale, Wirral councils, and a spell at Waitmans. So I was looking at the themes that emerged from the survey, and what a depressing effect this has had on us all. That's the overwhelming wave that came from you all. So shall we all vent, or I'll vent so that you don't have to? We all saw it coming, didn't we? As soon as you read the impact assessment, which calculated the adjusted LPS would save over £200 million per annum on the current spend, and would just cost 135.65 million each year, as opposed to a fully operational DOLs framework, which would cost over £2 billion each year. You knew what the motivation was. And I'm going to harp on a little bit, so something was disappeared early on in the LPS, but it just showed how unrealistic it was. It left the building quite early on, but to me, it was the raison d'etre of what they were doing, which is that it was to save money for local authorities and trusts. It relates to the care home manager's role, and as soon as we read that the care home managers would be expected to take over the role of guardians of human rights in their residents, with half a day to a day's training, I think we realised it was a desperate attempt to save money and a cosmetic nod to the human rights of the people affected. If you imagine care home managers with a very little training becoming people who became BIAs, they were going to have to deal with consulting relevant persons. They were going to have to gather medical evidence. Well, it was going to have to be a pretty intense half-day training session that would get them up to that. And to go revert to what Alex was saying with about the future, well, human rights, unfortunately, is now a dirty word to the two major political parties, and we do have to wonder where it's all going and what will bring this back into the forefront of governmental thinking. I'm sure I'm not the only one who looked at the social media and press the other week and thought, well, if only they'd put Philip Schofield in a care home, or ruled that Prince Harry's security arrangements amounted to a dolls at home, we'd soon sort it out. There can have been very few failed projects which have cost so much time, effort and money as this for hard-pressed local authorities, health bodies and to care homes. And we do get cynical about care homes, but I think that the cost of this would have been the straw that broke the camel's back for some. There would have been impact on the, apart from anything else, on their staffing, but also on their public liability insurance and conditions which their insurers might impose would have clashed with the duty to keep the restrictions to their minimum. So again, as local authority lawyers or health lawyers or lawyers who are involved in the field, we knew that the good ones would do very, very well, and the awful troublesome ones would make hay at the expense of the vulnerable. So a little chronology as to how we got here. I'm going to go back into prehistory here, before DOLs, before the Care Act or even the Supreme Court were introduced, because sometimes it's a good thing to go back and look how we got here. In 1994, HL, a compliant person with autism, was detained in Bournemouth Psychiatric Hospital. In 1997, it all started going wrong when a temporary bus driver took on extra passengers and went on a different route, and HL understandably had a meltdown. I often wonder where it would have been if it hadn't been for an undertrained, insensitive bus driver. HL was informally admitted, and contact with his former carers was stopped in case he wished to leave with them. It's symptomatic, perhaps, that those making the decision didn't really think through the human rights impact, or if they did, they didn't apply it to everybody equally. Why should someone who wasn't detained under the MHA but was simply a compliant patient have less rights than someone who was? And the Bournemouth gap was born. The High Court initially ruled for the hospital. The Court of Appeal overturned that, and they were in turn overturned by the House of Lords. And there was clearly a gap, a deficiency in the law. These things take time, as we know, to get round to the European Court of Human Rights, but the British government was found against in October 2004. So in 2005, we had the Mental Capacity Act, which didn't actually deal with the issue. In 2007, as a response to the European Court of Human Rights decision in that case, there was a journey of consultation. It became clear that the problem was much more widespread, in that compliant but incapacitated adults in the care homes as well as hospitals might be deprived of their liberty under the meaning of the convention, not to mention those in other settings, which of course would come later when we'd look at that. The consultation resulted in the amendment of the Mental Capacity Act to contain the deprivation of liberty safeguards. This was intended to plug the Bournemouth gap by providing administrative and judicial safeguards for the adults who lack mental capacity. These came into force in 2009. The purpose was to ensure that there's an independent professional assessment of whether the person lacked the capacity to make their own decision about whether to be accommodated in a hospital or care home, and whether it was in their best interest to be detained. When you look back again to the LPS, you would wonder how they thought that care home managers would be the independent professionals who can make this assessment. Then, of course, we get to 2014, and we have Cheshire West and TP&Q. I was involved actually at the very inception of the Cheshire West case, which started as in the same way as HL did, with a dispute over contact. So, you know, if there's a lesson to be learned, it's sort the contact out, but don't end up being the council whose budget is completely expended for the next 5 years on going through the process for until we get to the Supreme Court. This looked at the criteria for determining living arrangements for people who mightn't have mental capacity to make these decisions themselves. And the original test set by the Court of Appeal was a person's life had to be compared with that of another person with the same characteristics. And therefore, what was a deprivation of liberty for some people might not be a deprivation for others. But this the Supreme Court said, confused the quality of the arrangements made with the question of whether those arrangements can constitute a deprivation of liberty. And as Lady Hale said, and as we all know and repeat regularly, a gilded cage is still a gilded cage. So the LPS were introduced in 2019 with the Mental Capacity Amendment Act. So, meanwhile, in a market in Wuhan, someone did something with food-wise to change the world, and in a tragic way for many. But we, meanwhile, kept training remotely for the impending LPS. Another issue which then came up in September 2019 was the Dear Child case, where Lady Hale confirmed that parents can't consent to deprivation of liberty for a teenager, so future authorisations had to be via the court. Again, you can't fault the logic, but suddenly we were all at the weakest spot in social services between children and adults. We were suddenly hit with a wave of new duties. We were then told in October 2020 that the LPS would come into force because it had been delayed due to the effect of the COVID pandemic on care homes and pressure in the sector. In April 2022, the LPS was to come into force. A consultation was due to end in July 2022. Fair to say that the consultation wasn't universally optimistic. Late 2023, given a likely date, spring 2024, 5th of April 2023, as Alex said, it was to be delayed beyond the life of the present Parliament. On the 13th of April this year, the BASW wrote a response expressing dismay. And on the 26th of May, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights under Joanna Cherry KC MP wrote detailed concerns about both the LPS and the present situation. And it is due tomorrow. So possibly not the best timing for this for us today, but you can have a look and see what they say tomorrow. I wouldn't hold our collective breath. So there we are. We are no further forward, are we, since 2009? And in fact, since then, the courts, in trying to remedy the defects in the original legislation, have heaped duty upon the unhappy participants in the schemes, which would be okay if we all had funds for them. But of course, the funds have been very tight. For many people within the system, the Boreham gap is as much of a canyon as it ever was, despite the good intentions of everyone concerned. An awful lot of people in the survey said very similar things, and I picked out a couple of them just to highlight, but I don't think there's any major disagreement amongst people as to what problem we've got now and the problem we're going to have in the near future. The REX is cumbersome, huge delays, huge resource implications. Every renewal needs a repetition of earlier work. I think Alex is later going to deal with some suggestions regarding this, but we really are between the devil and the deep blue sea. It's a legal duty to carry this out for everyone, but no one I know, correct me if I'm wrong, can possibly manage it. So it's like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain for every day of our working lives. And I include that reference in case Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg are listening in, so they don't understand what we're saying. The preparation and costs that everyone's been put through into an LPS, I've already raised that as an issue, but how many hours have we put in? How many internal processes have been debated, forms invented and reinvented? How much better could all our time have been spent? And to finalise a couple of brief personal points, you do have to wonder, although the framework's there now, how much better off HL from Bournemouth would be today in the practical terms, with given the delays that we've got. We know what should happen now, but does it? It's reliant on the individual characteristics, competence, ethics of people around, and the supply that we have. And when you have a law which simply cannot be complied with, where does that leave you? Because I think all of us here spend our time trying to tell our clients, whoever they be, you must comply with the law. And then in the knowledge that in this particular section, no one can do it. So what do you do? Do you prioritize who's going to complain? And where does that kind of thinking lead? What does it do for good practice? What does it do for our general respect for the law? And in a society that's becoming increasingly fractured and divided, when those in charge can't obey the law, where does that leave us? So to answer all that, the main draw for today, ladies and gentlemen, the Rolling Stones. Sorry, I mean Alex Ruck Keene KC.
Graeme, you are doing yourself down. You are doing yourself down, not least because that was just such a helpful stock take of how we got here. And actually, the thing which was resonating with me all the way through was both the golden thread of HL himself, not least because Graham Enderby, who is one of his foster carers, died relatively recently. And whenever one heard Graham talking about HL and the battle that they fought, and then his wondering about whether this was all just a complete waste of his time and HL's time, and what it had actually done to improve anything, always lived with me. There's a very good Radio 4 play about it, or Radio 4 play followed by discussion. And then kind of linked to that was when DOLs was introduced back in 2009, the impact assessment back then, I'm sure those of you with longer memories will remember this, they genuinely thought that DH, as it was, genuinely thought that with training, we could reduce the number of DOLs authorizations required over time to something in the order of 7,000 a year. Because they thought, and I think most people thought, deprivation of liberty was a very bad thing. Could we stop people doing it, please? And obviously one of the outcomes of Cheshire West and then Read D is to really get across that message that pretty much everybody who's got complex care needs is always going to be deprived of their liberty. It's just going to be gradations of deprivation of liberty. And I do sometimes set for my students at King's College London the question, is Cheshire West a great Pyrrhic victory for human rights? And I think you've actually in some ways brought that out rather strongly with your last comments, not least because we've got a system where if everybody's deprived of their liberty, public authorities are more or less completely unable to meet the demand, even with the best will in the world, and the will is almost always there. And then there doesn't seem to be much comeback where people don't do that. Yes, we sometimes get ombudsman investigations and reports, which I know some of the people who've been on the receiving end of some of the ombudsman inquiries and complaints in relation to DOLs are on this call, and I know they feel very hard done by because they think the ombudsman is picking and singling them out unfairly for having, as it were, upfront triage systems. But with the exception of the ombudsman, we haven't had tsunamis of claims for unlawful deprivation of liberty. I know lots of public authorities probably settle quite a few early on, but we haven't had a tsunami of claims, which at one level for hard-pressed local authorities and ICBs is a good thing. At another level, it makes it difficult to say, well, any of this really matters. This has got real consequences, real world consequences, which makes it incredibly difficult for people in your position, Graham, and others on this call to make the case to those upstairs holding the purse strings that actually we need to keep doing this. And it's just inordinately depressing, actually. But one of the things I think we were trying to do today is, and I think it was very important you did the sort of therapy venting bit, Graham, was to try to make sure we didn't spend just an hour kind of driving ourselves into existential angst. So we will start I'm going to start coming up with, throwing the floor open to you, Graham, for some suggestions. I'm going to come up with some suggestions as things we can think about doing. But before I do that, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that I did find quite striking in the survey. I mean, it's really interesting. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a survey of anyone done since the news came out about LPS. There's also been informal stuff on Twitter, we've got things like BASWA having put in that very strong response or statement saying they're very disappointed. Any Welsh colleagues on here, Welsh government came out really fighting, I mean, in really strong language, saying we are very disappointed with that LPS is not being introduced. I mean, it's pretty strong to have the two parts of the system trying to think about deprivation of liberty either side of the English-Welsh border, you know, one of them being quite so grumpy about what's happened on the other side. But we haven't had kind of too many surveys yet, and albeit not from the world's biggest response rate, and I hope the local government lawyer is able to keep the survey open for later, in case people want to put further things in. But the majority of people are feeling somewhat annoyed that LPS is not being introduced. There was a small, vocal, important minority saying they actually thought LPS was just going to be almost even worse. There was a group of people who I have to say I have a significant degree of sympathy with, who said they were very concerned that LPS, as built on by the draft code of practice, was going to be hugely problematic. Because I think there's a discussion that people may well want to have about the extent to which the draft code of practice was laying onto the statutory bones of LPS an awful lot of complexity, which actually wasn't in the scheme and was going to be made, make things going to be made much more complicated. So I think that so there were people picking up on that. The other thing I was interested in is, I mean, of course, the number of, as Graeme's identified, the number of people who had organisations which had really started to invest quite a lot of resource in trying to think about how to upskill for LPS, how to embed stuff. And then people thinking, actually, some of this has produced some good results. So, for instance, you know, starting to share knowledge amongst children's services about the MCA, about deprivation of liberty, and then the feeling about how can we continue that. The other aspect, and I have to say this was a question that I really wanted to have included in the survey, because it's something which I think is something we need to grapple with quite rapidly, was in relation to the number of public local authorities who divide divide things as between DOLs and community DOL. And it was very interesting. The majority of people who responded, their organisations, so local authorities, are going to have they have separate DOLs teams and people considering community DOL. And one thing, just to kind of start segueing into, well, how should we be doing things, is I personally think it's really important to take a step back and say, well, why do we have that? Because, not least because now we've got CQC in England beginning to start breathing down the neck of public or local authorities in terms of how they're discharging their Care Act, and CQC clearly being interested in deprivation of liberty issues. How adequate a response is it to CQC to say, well, we know we've got problems, but actually our DOLs team are doing okay, as it were, but our community DOL applications, there's a bigger backlog there. I mean, if I was CQC, I'd be saying, I don't care. Actually, if you're involved in thinking about deprivation of liberty issues, and of course, a potentially unlawful deprivation of liberty is potentially a Section 42 safeguarding inquiry matter, because the person may well be at abuse or neglect, because abuse could be an unnecessary deprivation of liberty with overly restrictive steps in place. If you haven't checked up, you haven't done checks and balances, how do you know that that isn't actually authorised or isn't actually the least restrictive option? So I think where organisations have separate bodies, I'd really be wanting to ask people why. And if you've got separate bodies looking at things, what are you doing in terms of making sure that you're aligning your approaches, and aligning your approaches in terms of thinking about capacity, thinking about best interest, thinking about necessity and proportionality? Because you should be doing the same things. It's essentially, one is being rooted, or things are having to think about being rooted into the supervisory body side, the BIA side, the others being rooted into the Court of Protection, but ultimately they're the same things that you should be concerned about. One thing just to say, because Graeme mentioned, is in relation to re-ex applications, so community deprivation of liberty applications. When I've shut up in a minute and let Graeme take the floor, I will put into the chat function a link to the deprivation of liberty guidance that we've done in chambers, the judicial deprivation of liberty guidance. So in other words, community DOL applications. I'll put a link into the chat function to that, because that includes the results of a workshop which the Court of Protection convened last year with some of the Court of Protection judges at First Avenue House in London, trying to flag things that they see coming in which cause them problems in terms of dealing with matters quickly, because they are very aware that the users of the Court of Protection are extremely cheesed off at how the Court of Protection is managing to operate the REX system at the moment. And so they're very keen to try and see what it is that people can do to eliminate problems in terms of the paperwork. The Court of Protection is badly stuffed, to use a technical term, in terms of the resources it has. The major problem is not so much the judges, although they're pretty short on judges to think about REX applications. They're trying to get more in. They're particularly stuffed on the admin staff and the computer resources required, the digital resources, allowing actually the application to make its way from you sending it in to the judge receiving it. And whilst they're getting better at trying to reduce that, that's one of the reasons why, and this came up in the survey, and I'm sure people will have it on the chat function as well. Why is it that we've put in an application and it's over 12 months since we've heard anything? And then the first thing we hear is a judge sending an order back saying, I can't decide this without an up-to-date capacity assessment and care plan. And people go, well, it's not my fault it's out of date. Can't you just do your job? I'm not here on behalf of the judges, but on their behalf, they are making a decision whether on P's behalf to consent to the care arrangements confined in them. They can't do that unless they're satisfied that the evidence before them is up to date. And if the problem has been in the kind of admin services at the court getting them that application, the judge is stuffed and you're then stuffed. I mean, one thing, of course, you can always do is write back to the court and say that nothing has changed, and put in a short witness statement saying there has been no change to any of this, therefore there's no need for an updated care plan, or essentially the care plan still remains current. That can reassure them. And finally, just on but it's obviously a short-term solution. Finally, on REX, and then I'm going to let Graeme pick up on thoughts he might be having about stuff he's troubled about or practical solutions, and then I can chip in with more. And please start asking questions in the chat function as well, because these are things, it's your chance to raise stuff while we come up with ideas of our own. On the REX side, the Court of Protection Rules Committee Court of Protection had an LPS working group. I sat on it. It is now being reconstituted as describe it what you would like. My internal, for myself, working name is DOLs/Community DOL Survival Group. I'm absolutely sure that's not the official name. In fact, it isn't the official name. But the Court of Protection is now in the same position that you are in, where they are thinking, well, LPS is not coming dramatically to change the terrain, and in the Court of Protection's case to save the day in some ways, because the Court of Protection was then not going to be having to deal with lots and lots of community DOL applications. Of course, the Court of Protection was going to be gearing up for an awful lot of Section 21ZA applications, so the equivalent to Section 21A challenges, but those have a different flavour to them. The Court of Protection won't be able to do that because LPS isn't coming in. Court of Protection is going to be doing to see what it can do to think about, are there any things which can be done in terms of making the COP/DOL 11 forms easier? I mean, I think there might be some room. I have to say, I'm not sure how much room there necessarily is, because most of the stuff in there is stuff which is necessary, you know, for the Court of Protection actually to be able to do its job. But if anyone's got any suggestions of things which can be stripped out, please feel very free to raise them, or email me after the event, but feel very free to raise them now. The other thing I think the Court of Protection hopefully can really think about, and I'm not here on behalf of that committee, so there's no official status to this. This is me just trying to think aloud. I think it would be really helpful if the Court of Protection could sit down and think, is there a process which could be put in place for renewals? Because I think and I'm glad to see Graeme nodding there, because obviously when the COP/DOL 10, as it was called now, COP/DOL 11 was set up, this was in anticipation of LPS coming in, or the equivalent coming in pretty soon. So actually there would never be any renewals. But we're now in a situation where we're multiply renewed. Is there something which can be done to make that a lighter touch affair? Obviously, DOLs, there's a problem in relation to renewals. You don't have the ability to renew. On DOL's side, you've got the ability to do things like equivalent assessments, and you've got the ability to do a lighter touch, but you have actually formally got to go around the whole house again. Luckily, for these purposes, the Court of Protection isn't bound by some statutory problem, which is a problem here. It might be able to do something creative. So I can see a couple of people agreeing with, let's see if we can strip back and we think about renewals. Graeme, have you got thoughts either on that or on the kind of what from the DOLs side you're troubled about, or DOLs side things we can do?
That was really a lot of helpful information there, Alex. I'm sure that people who have tuned in today will find some of the information there they haven't had before, and other sources or whatever. That's really helpful. I was wondering whether there could be some way set up for the court to triage the re-exes, either sort of deputy district judges or even non-judicial people who could pick out those issues that you raised before. And whether, so I know this kind of feels wrong, feels maybe dehumanizing, but whether a tick box could be expanded to so that the court can instantly see a line of what isn't happening and what is happening, and then perhaps move them further up the chain for the ones which might be problematic. When you're talking about the community DOLs, that they can provide terrible difficulties for those on the ground. You have to have a balance, don't you, between family dynamics and cultural issues as well, and the minimizing of the restrictions that the person's under. And where does best interests lie? You minimize the restrictions, the placement then becomes less stable, and the whole lives can be impacted on. Having said that, they're entitled to their liberty. It's a very, very fraught area, and I know everyone here will have cases like that where, again, families don't conform to one norm. They can be very different and very difficult, but one perhaps has to try and look at it from the perspective of the person who's in the DOL. So that is a significant issue. Whether, again, going back to triaging, whether there could be some system set up, but maybe where the court deals with BIAs from other authorities who maybe go through and pick out the difficulties, because although the judges are very good, they come from a different background. I wonder whether it was, almost expanding the re-exes into almost like, when we had magistrates courts and crown courts and whatever, whether there's some role for non-judicial persons to become involved who have their own expertise, or like a tribunal, whether that would, because the backlog is a massive problem, and it isn't going to get better in local authorities when the incentive isn't there, because we know the backlog is with the court. But then equally, again, I think, on prioritization, the court will think, well, actually, most of these are okay. So need we not look at the ones which are problematic?
Yeah, that's some really, just to pick on that last one, people have floated for quite a long time the idea of, shouldn't cop cases go to a tribunal? And the Law Commission, certainly when I was there thinking about what isn't going to become LPS now, or at least in the foreseeable future, there was some considerable discussion about that. And there's a lot, in the abstract, a lot to be said for having three heads looking at it, or one, one, at least more than one head. I think the reality is that that's such a big change in terms of how things are done. That would be I mean, that's going to be very, very difficult to try and achieve. And there's no way that a judge, as the COP is currently constituted, can, as it were, outsource any of their thinking to a BI, or outsource any of their thinking, their judicial thinking, to anybody else on that aspect. Which also, I think, rather nobbles the idea of, is it possible for the court to delegate some of the community dole determinations to authorised court officers? Because authorised court officers are the people who deal with most of the uncontested property and affairs matters. So they're civil servants discharging a judicial function, which is already mildly edgy. I think the judiciary would be very concerned about civil servants discharging judicial functions in terms of authorising deprivation of liberty. So I'm not meaning to sound negative, but I am sounding negative in the sense, yeah. And I think as one of the people in the chat function, you know, it is supposed to re-ex itself. It's supposed to automatically, already supposed to be a form of triage. You know, it's supposed to be, because there are all those duties of candour on you to explain, you know, is there anything about this which seems unusual and should be flagging it into the kind of full-on Section 16 oral hearing matter. And actually, just on that, one point one of you on the chat function has flagged up very rightly is, of course, 16 and 17-year-old applications are already viewed differently by the Court of Protection. And as you've flagged up, almost all of them are being listed for oral hearings, so they're not being treated as streamlined. And that, if you want an explanation of why that's the case, you will. I put in the chat function a webinar we did, or the seminar we did in Chambers on deprivations of liberty of children and young people in the COP, and Senior Judge Hilda gives a presentation part of the way through about her experiences authorising deprivation of liberty for 16, 17-year-olds in the Court of Protection. And it is fair to say she was genuinely troubled by the applications she was seeing. And she was genuinely troubled by the fact the applications were coming in on the basis of, there is nothing to see here, please move on. So in other words, these weren't applications coming in saying we think these are high-end restrictions. These were applications coming in saying we think this is entirely routine. And she was really troubled, I think, by the mismatch between things which are considered entirely routine for 16, 17-year-olds and routine for older adults. And part of that may come back to your point, Graeme, I think, about what families, there are different perceptions amongst families, different perceptions among people working with families about what might be okay for 16, 17-year-olds versus adults. But it's fair to say that Senior Judge Hilda, I think, would require a lot of persuasion now that what routinely happens for 16, 17-year-olds is okay. And I have to say, based on my experience in some of the cases, I'm probably on her side. It just slows everything up for all of the people who are, as it were, doing things which are genuinely routine. Yeah. And yeah, so one question, just I think we'll do one little tiny bit more on community dole and then move on to DOLs just for time, but I know there are some people who are really troubled about community dole and some really interesting questions coming in. So this one question about, should local authorities commission an independent Rule 1.2 advocate? I mean, obviously, you are stuck with this issue that there are going to be quite a few cases, and there's actually someone else in the chat function has flagged up earlier, where the courts are getting edgy about the suitability of people who are put forward as 1.2 advocates. I mean, sometimes there's just no one around, and sometimes it's being put forward, the family member is being put forward, or a family member friend who's been put forward, and the court is a bit edgy about the extent to which they are really able to operate in a quasi RPR sort of way, because that's what 1.2 representatives are meant to be. And then if the court's edgy about that, then this slows everything down, because then they're going to scrabble around saying, could you find us someone who looks like they could be properly independent? So there's a question of, is it worth just biting the bullet up front? But then, of course, you are having to find some human beings to do it and find some money to do it. I don't know whether you've got sort of practical stuff also, you're grappling with.
Also, the families might themselves feel, you know, edged out of the process. Again, you have to bear in mind the relationship built up between the families and social workers, which can be very difficult over a long time, and for the families to then feel that people are suspecting us. Having said that, there are many families who you are rightly suspecting, I think. I mean, you raise the issue there, and I think one of the concerns is where, where a compensation fund comes into it, and the family are administering the compensation funds, and you don't really see the divisions between what's correct for their child, even though they're no longer a child, and themselves, which can lead to some very complicated cases. But that's a very good point. The point made about should be commissioning independent people, as you rightly make the point. How are we going to pay for it? If you've got a very small number, maybe, but if not, we're again just adding a layer of expense onto layer of expense onto layer of expense, and some family members in some circumstances can be absolutely excellent representatives for. So I don't know what the answer is to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think just as we move off on from community DOL and just in relation to 1.2 RP/RPRs, I think one of the things I always see 1.2 representatives as functionally independent, analogous to RPRs, and that was certainly the view of Mr. Justice Charles in the NRA case years ago. And so when you're trying to think of who could do it, what's the guidance we should be giving them about what they should be doing, and what are the circumstances under which we say, actually, we know you're a real champion for your human, but actually we think you're too close, you can't sufficiently distinguish between your views and that of the human, that you're relevant human. That's when we can't, we're going to have to think of somebody else. All that guidance in relation to RPRs, I think, tracks across onto 1.2 representatives. But I think one of the things it might be helpful for the Rules Committee to think about would be, is there further guidance which could be issued about this? In terms of what the court's expectations are, so that at least people making applications to court know what the expectations are. So moving on to DOLs, not least because there's some interesting question, sort of stuff about simplification. Thanks very much for one of you providing a beautiful segue in the chat function by way of a question there. So on the DOLs side, of course, I think it's important to distinguish two things from my perspective. Or three things rather. One, what does the Act and the regulations actually require you to do? And by you, I mean local authority. I'm speaking specifically to local authorities here. If you're a health body, you're going to be in a situation of a managing authority, and I'm less. I mean, it's on the DOLs paperwork side. I'm more troubled at the moment. So what is it that actually the Act requires you to do? And just spoiler alert: if you actually read the Mental Capacity Act, you don't even have to see the person to carry out any of the assessments, which raises the question of why are we seeing people? I think there's obviously very good reasons you want to see people a lot of the time, but if the Act isn't saying you've got to see people, why is everybody thinking we need to see people the whole time, say, in terms of carrying out assessments? I'm not saying go away, never see anyone again. I'm just saying, what does the Act say? It's remarkably light touch. Then what does the Code of Practice say in terms of layering things on? Well, the Code of Practice says all sorts of things, but the Code of Practice is radically out of date in lots of ways. So the DOLs Code of Practice. It is also statutory guidance to which proper regard has to be had. And if you're going to depart from it, you have good reasons. There are multiple reasons why there are good reasons to depart from the Code of Practice in some respects at the moment in terms of what it's saying people should do. But it's a question of going back to what the Act says, what the regulations say. Then, in terms of the forms, so where some local authorities use the ADAS forms, which are, I think ADAS would be the first to agree, are now somewhat out of date. They need revisiting. Obviously, totally low priority when it looked like LPS was coming into effect. LPS is not coming into effect. There's now quite a lot of consideration I'm aware of from ADAS thinking about what can we do in terms of the forms. Are there simplifications we can use? Are there forms we can use which really flag up the circumstances under which we're using multiple equivalents? Or those interesting ones where the equivalent is actually older than 12 months, so it's not an age one, so we're not simply allowed to rely on it. But actually, this is about, for instance, a mental health diagnosis, which is of long standing. Yes, the initial formal diagnosis was 12 months ago. Well, why is it not possible for the mental health assessor to do, I have considered the previous assessment, I've considered all the circumstances, nothing has changed, therefore my assessment for DOL's purposes is that this person satisfies the mental health requirement. That's an entirely legally coherent assessment for MCA purposes or for DOLs purposes, why are we not necessarily doing that? So and so there's work. So the forms, luckily, so the ADAS forms are luckily within the zone of things it's easier to deal with, because they're not statutory, they're not DHSC controlled. Anything to do with DOLs is completely impossible to deal with where it's statutory, because we'd need to get statutory change, either primary legislation or secondary legislation, neither of which are possible at the moment. Code of practice, as I said, take a long, hard look at it and think, in my organisation, are there things we're doing where they're either based on the code or based on our custom and practice, what we think is best practice? And if it's best practice, it's very likely to be very good, and the BIA's trying to do their jobs, frequently doing, as it were, going beyond what the Act says. Hurrah, excellent. But every single BIA who's doing a Rolls-Royce job in relation to Graeme is a BIA who is not able to do any job at all in relation to the 16 people sitting behind Graeme. And I think there's some pretty long, hard Paddington stairs which need to be given at practices and procedures at the moment, thinking, how do we spread matters? How do we spread resource in a necessary or in a proportionate fashion? And I think there's some quite robust discussions which need to be had. They're very depressing discussions, but I think they're quite robust discussions which need to be had. And they're robust discussions which need to be had amongst the BIA leads, the DOLs leads, but also, of course, including the adult social care lawyers, because you guys and humans are going to be advising on the risk. And that's also going to be a question of banging the drum for ADAS and DHSC to come out with what is the acceptable practices now? What are things we can do? I mean, ADAS issued that kind of emergency interim guidance in the immediate aftermath of Cheshire West about things which could be done on a light touch basis. It's that kind of stuff which I think needs to be done in order to give people the confidence that if they're putting their head above the parapet in terms of being more robust about stuff, they're not just going to get completely shot down. So I think those are things which people need to start thinking about. We tried to do some, my colleague Neil Allen led on work in the May 39 Essex Chambers Mental Capacity Report, which one of you's picked up on. There's more work which can be done there. Graeme, you're looking troubled, and I'm glad you're looking troubled. So if you unmute yourself and share your trouble.
No, mainly trouble because there's someone trying to deliver a parcel to my house. Yeah, no, I was wondering whether for renewals there could be really a very simple form which basically says, has anything changed? And is this one that falls within, you know, a condition which is not going to change? Yes. Has anything changed since last year? Yes or no? I'm just wondering whether we could get really down to that, because the renewals are a major problem to people in practice, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously one interesting point is your equivalents run out statutorily if they're older than 12 months, but there is nothing in the language of the Mental Capacity Act to say assessment necessarily means more than the engagement of a professional person's brain, suitably qualified person's brain, yeah, as to whether the conditions are met. That's what the Act says. And so, yes, there are definitely things which could be done there, especially in circumstances where this is a person who's been subject to 3 12-month authorizations within the same care home which they chose to go into. There's no reason to think that anything other than that's the place they want to be. What is the point in going into this in quite the same way? I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to make sure, Anne, are you wanting us, as it were, to draw stumps there? Because we've got other questions we could take, but if we want to draw stumps,
yeah, I think maybe if you could pick up 1 or 2 questions and we'll wrap it up in 2 minutes, if that's okay, Alex. Thank you.
Can I just flag one question which is just about this, going back to 16, 17-year-olds, so children accommodated in Section 20 and 16 plus. Just to remind you all, Section 20 gives Children Act gives no authority to anybody to do anything in terms of deprivation of liberty, whether that be pre-16, where a parent might be able to consent to confinement, but that's not coming out of Section 20. And in relation to a 16, 17-year-old, a parent definitely can't consent to confinement. So the question is, where do you go thereafter? My strong advice is, if the 16, 17-year-old has got the sort of impairment and the sort of circumstances which is likely to them being a lifelong customer of the Court of Protection, as it were, it's much better to start getting before the Court of Protection sooner rather than later, rather than going to the High Court, because otherwise you're then going to have to go off again to a different court when the child turns 18.
Thank you, Alex. I think we'll call it a day there if that's okay with everybody. And it just remains for me to thank you both very much for that fascinating insight and some practical suggestions on where we go next. I don't think this will be the last installment of this discussion, but it's a subject we will come back to again. But thank you very much to everyone for coming today and for your fascinating insights and contributions and questions, which have made it a lively discussion. We will send you a copy of the webinar, and the links that have been shared in the chat will be circulated there too, together with the survey that Derek has very kindly put a link to in the chat. If you wouldn't mind completing that, it would be very useful for Alex, Graeme and others who want to follow up on this. But that is it for today. Thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you again at another event. Thank you.